I'm speaking now with Tetyana Teren, one of Ukraine's leading journalists and the executive director of PEN Ukraine. Tetyana, welcome.
Happy to see you, Askold.
My pleasure, absolutely. So Tetyana, I wonder if we could just begin by finding out a little bit about you. If you could tell us a little bit about where you were born, where you grew up, a little bit about your family and your family history.
Yes, I always tell that I have three native cities because I was born in Poltava region, and this is my native place in this world. But also I spent 8 years in Kharkiv. I was graduated from the Kharkiv University, and then I started working there as a journalist, as a TV host in Kharkiv. But also it's already 10 years when I have been living in Kyiv. So this is my third native city in Ukraine. And, you know, unfortunately for a very long time, I told that I can't feel Kyiv. It's a very big city. There's many millions of people from different Ukrainian cities. But, you know, especially now, this last month, I have such a strong feeling that this is my main city of my life. And it's very difficult to live in another city now. In Ukraine, of course, to feel that Ukraine now big country, and you feel, of course, in Ukraine everywhere in our country. But this time it's very important to feel this, not to feel, yes, this distance with Kyiv. And you know, 2 weeks ago, I visited Kyiv. It was first time after 1 month in Lviv. And it's really very difficult for myself to describe all my feelings after this trip to my city.
So we've come to the city in wartime quickly. I wonder if before we land there, if you could tell us a little bit more about the differences between Poltava, Kharkiv, and Kyiv, and give people a sense of what's distinct about each region.
You know, I can say that I'm from the central part of Ukraine, and for me it's very important to feel myself as a part of central and eastern Ukraine. Yes, it's really very important. But of course, all these cities have some difference, and it's normal situation, of course, for such a big country as Ukraine. Poltava and Poltava region, of course, speaks Ukrainian and speaks Surzhyk. So I grew up in Ukrainian-speaking community, Ukrainian-speaking village, small village in Poltava region. You know, when I was a student in the Kharkiv University, when I studied journalism in Kharkiv, I had such a goal to understand Poltava, to understand my region. And from time to time, I went to Poltava and I tried to write some articles, some investigations about musicians, artists, writers from Poltava. It was my professional aim in that period of time. And you know, unfortunately, so many bright artists decided to leave Poltava and moved to Kyiv or Lviv or other Ukrainian cities. So we know so many great authors who are from Poltava, and I'm proud of them very much. But all of them decided to leave this city. And you know, this is very quiet region. This is very quiet part of Ukraine. But sometimes I felt in Poltava that I felt this lack of energy, of art energy maybe. And I felt this energy always in Kharkiv. Yes, Kharkiv, this is a city of students. This is a city of culture, of literature, and of this drive and energy. Yes. it was a difficult period of my life when I lived in Kharkiv, to be honest, because I was from Ukrainian-speaking region. And when I moved to Kharkiv, I had to study Russian language and Russian literature because we had such courses in my university, but I didn't learn Russian language in my school. So these 5 years in university, it was a bit difficult experience. Not only because I didn't know Russian, but for me it was a bit weird, uncomfortable to speak Russian, to learn Russian. So it was a big problem for myself. So I tried to explain you my first feelings in Kharkiv, these uncomfortable, unfortunately feelings, but I'm honest with you in this interview. But I need to say that I was very happy in Kharkiv professionally, because I started to work in Kharkiv as a journalist. For 5 or 6 years, I was a special reporter, special journalist for the big Ukrainian newspaper Ukraina Молода. And it was just my own desire to write for this newspaper. So I decided to write for them without any invitation. So I started to write about Kharkiv writers, musicians, about Kharkiv museums and bright cultural events. So I think that during that 8 years, I wrote really about the main figures in Kharkiv culture. And of course, even today, I'm a big fan of Kharkiv culture. And I don't know another city, as I told you already, with such a cultural drive. Yes. And what I also like in Kharkiv life, this feeling of cultural community. Because of course, Kharkiv is not such a big city as Kyiv, for example. And of course, you know everybody who work in this cultural field. And it's really big pleasure to have this possibility every day to see all these people who work in their special places, who work as artists or musicians, and every day you can have these meetings, you can visit theaters or museum exhibitions, and it was really great feeling of life. Yes, so I remember always these feelings. And also I started to work as a TV host in Kharkiv, and it was also a big professional pleasure because my director of our TV channel decided to allow me to work with literature, TV literature. So I was a TV host of a program which was dedicated to the new Ukrainian books. So I had the possibility to record Ukrainian writers and Ukrainian intellectuals and spoke to them about new books and about important ideas in our culture. It was a big pleasure for myself, and during next years I tried to find again this possibility, but unfortunately culture even now is not the main topic in our media, and this is of course a big problem. So I lived in Kharkiv during 8 years, and then unfortunately there was a new period in Kernes period in Kharkiv. You might know about this this person in Kharkiv history. And when this new period of Dobkin and Kernes started in Kharkiv history, unfortunately, main media and main TV channels were closed, and so many Kharkiv journalists had to move to other cities, yes, to find other places for their work and for their ideas. So it was time when I decided to move to Kyiv. 10 years ago. As I told you, I felt that I'm a part of Kyiv twice. Of course, in 2014, when I had this possibility to visit Maidan every day, to have my small responsibilities, yes, to work in a kitchen, for example, or to work with volunteers. It was really great time and great feeling of our city. But I can't even describe now, maybe I'm not ready to describe my feeling to Kyiv today. It's something bigger than I'm just possible to describe. Because, 2 weeks ago, when I returned to Kyiv after 1 month, I felt that Kyiv, it's not only this old borders of our city, because after all these crimes in Bucha, in Irpin, in Hostomel and other towns around Kyiv, you feel that Kyiv become bigger. And it's maybe not only about Kyiv, it's already about Ukraine, that everywhere in Ukraine, whether you are in Kyiv or in Kharkiv or in Lviv or Uzhhorod, you feel Ukraine everywhere. You feel this pain in Mariupol, you feel Kharkiv, you feel Kherson, Crimea. I think that never we have had such feeling of the whole country. If I can explain today this feeling, because maybe I need and other people also need time to find right words for our current feelings.
Well, what you're describing, I think, is a sense of solidarity and unity, right, across the country, and that sense that what is happening to one part of the Ukrainian body is felt by the whole country, and so that the pain in Mariupol, the pain in Kharkiv, the pain in Kherson is being experienced in Lviv and Kyiv as well. And I think you might also be aware that it's being experienced widely across this country. This morning I was listening to our local NPR National Public Radio station, and the conversation was all about Ukraine and these local hosts, pure Bostonians with no ties at all to Eastern Europe, were simply saying, we can't sit here and watch this happen, we must do something more. So it's a powerful sentiment that I hope continues to rise up the ranks into the voices, into the minds and awareness of the deciders, our representatives, who, after all, need to hear what the population of the United States is asking for, that is, for more support for Ukraine. But I want to ask you a little bit about what it was like when the war began. Were you surprised when you were in Kyiv? Because I was in touch with a couple of people in the weeks leading up to the war, and people were mainly telling me that they thought that nothing would happen, that Putin was bluffing, and that we kept hearing these reports of the tanks circling and so on. And then I know that I kept hoping that this was just some kind of a game. Were you surprised? Did you expect this?
I can say that I was surprised. I think that everybody was shocked, not surprised. And of course, I think nobody was waiting for such a scenario in this war. I remember this previous 2 or 3 weeks when so many our foreign partners and colleagues called or wrote to us and asked about our plans. Yes, because when they heard all this news from American politicians, for example, or European, they, of course, thought that we need to prepare to all these scenarios. Yes, we need to prepare as a big organization. Yes, when we need to think about different plans in this situation. But usually, to be honest, I told them that you need to remember that it's already 8 years of our war, yes, which Russia continuous in our country. But of course, when I woke up in the morning, yes, February 24, of course, I was shocked, as everybody. I saw all these messages and calls from my relatives, colleagues, friends, so many calls and messages that morning everybody had in Ukraine. But you know, this first week of the war, of this new period of the war, I was very quiet and strict inside myself. Maybe it's something about psychology, and maybe it's normal situation. I don't know, normal behavior for the human being. But I remember very well this first day of the war, because I decided to go to our office. So I spent this February day in the office of PEN Ukraine. I decided to finish all main processes. Yes, I decided to solve main tasks which we had for that moment. Then only in the evening, despite of all these sounds of explosions around, I returned to my house, and only in the evening I started to think about the situation. So I decided to finish all my work responsibilities, and only then I understood that I need to think about this, emergency backpack with all necessary things. So then I spent the first week in Kyiv with my friend and her relatives in the center of Kyiv. So it was a week which I never forgot, never forgive. Yes, it was a difficult week, but it was very clear in every moment. It was very clear in our conversations with friends, with men who decided to go to the army, with our relatives in other cities, with our colleagues. So it was a week of very big solidarity, not only inside Ukraine, but also with all our colleagues, with other PEN centers abroad. Yes, so I will remember this first week for the whole life, I think. Yes, but then there was a big explosion near our house. Maybe you remember about this news about TV channel. Yes, in the center of the center of Kyiv, near metro station Dorogozhichi. So it was a time. Yes, and also near Baban Yar. So it was time to understand what to do in this close future, just to understand your role in all these events. Yes, whether you could be useful in Kyiv, or you need to be useful in other fields. And then if you decide to be useful, for example, in your organization, yes, and you could be useful, so you need to think about a place for your work. Yes, and at that moment I understood that I need to leave my city. And it was the most difficult decision, the most difficult night, maybe during all these war days in my life.
I can imagine. Let me take you back to a happier moment before that, because we never did actually get to you transitioning from journalism to the really incredible work you've done as the executive director of PEN. I mean, I have just from a distance observed what a effective organization it has become. And now, I've worked with writers my whole life, and I know that trying to work with writers is like trying to herd cats. They're not people who are particularly inclined to always to collaboration, and that's the way it should be. That's one of the reasons, of course, that one reads different writers to understand powerfully articulated different points of view. but you have indeed managed to somehow survive in this very complicated role for a long time. Or you could just tell me a little bit about how you made that transition and what that has been like. Because if I were to generalize, and again, as a fiction writer, I always say that all generalizations are false, including this one, and one doesn't want to go too far down that road. But Ukrainian writers seem to be a singularly stubborn and tough breed, who have, I think, also in their own way shocked and moved the world by their resistance. And we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But if you could just tell us a little bit about your own sort of transition into this role and what that's been like and what you think the organization means.
I think that I didn't have this moment of transition because even in my university period of life, I always mixed journalism with cultural management. So even in Kharkiv, I organized many events, cultural events, especially meetings with Ukrainian writers. For example, we organized a meeting with Lina Kostenko in the Kharkiv Opera Theater. It was really big event, but also it was I don't know, we organized, I think, maybe 20, 30 different events in Kharkiv, different initiatives, campaigns. So I always like to mix different roles in my life. Then I also worked as an editor. I worked more in communications field, in publishing houses, for example. I work as an editor in Ukrainska Pravda, online media. I worked as an editor for the 5th TV channel. So I tried different roles, and I think it helps me to work with different tasks in my work. And when I came to PEN Ukraine 4 years ago already, I understood that it's really great place for myself, because here I can be as a curator, as the manager, as a journalist sometimes, and also so many different other roles. So I like this possibility to have different roles for myself, though unfortunately today I can say that I don't work as a journalist at all. And it's a big problem, because even at the beginning of my work in PEN Ukraine, I finished my book of interviews with Taras Prohasko, and I had a dream to finish the 4th volume of my book of interviews with other Ukrainian writers, requisites. And I even prepared all these materials and interviews, but I don't have time to finish this work. And it's of course a problem, but when you work with big organization, when you see our new projects, our new books, all our ideas, which could be also brought to life, it's also a big pleasure of cultural manager. I know, I think you know what I mean in this situation, but of course, every time I promise myself to have 1 or 2 months every year for my journalistic work, because it's even not about work today, it's about pleasure, important pleasure. So maybe we will, when we will win, I will take 1 month of vacation, and maybe I will finish my 4th book of interviews. Now I have such a dream, and also I have a dream to record big interviews with our intellectuals about their feelings during these weeks and months, because when I visited Kyiv recently, and I saw many our colleagues, many Ukrainian writers in Kyiv who spent all these weeks in Kyiv, I understood that it's very important to record their voices, to record their stories, and I know that I can do it. So I can listen to other people, and I love doing such things. So this is about journalistic part, but of course, today, first of all, I'm a manager of our organization. And I think Pan Ukraine, this is a very important mirror of our society, of our cultural community. And when we are together, so many of us together, we can do many important things in our cultural field, but also human rights fields. And this is really a unique combination, culture and human rights sphere.
No, yeah, I entirely agree. And I also think that anyone who has the capacity to organize is actually so needed right now. It's also its own great artistic gift to be able to bring people and processes together, to make things happen, to make material the immaterial. And you mentioned Nina Kostenko, and it reminded me that I'm not hearing anything about her, and I'm wondering about this older generation of writers. Nina Kostenko, for our audience, is one of Ukraine's most important voices of a generation that came of age in the 1960s. So she must be probably in her mid to late 80s at this point. What, for example, is happening with her? How is she? Has she remained in Kyiv, or has she left the city? Do you know?
To be honest, I don't know exactly, but it seems that she's still in Kyiv, I think. This event in Kharkiv, which I mentioned, it was her last public event, this presentation of her last novel, Записки сумасшедшего. So it was last event, and I remember these thousands of people. I even don't know exactly. But I remember this full opera theater in Kharkiv, and all these people who wanted to see and to hear her after so many years of her silence, public silence. But it seems she's still in Kyiv, and even now, when she has not published many new books, yes, for so many years, I think that even now she's the most popular, most famous writer in Ukraine, because if you see any of these social investigations, usually Lina Kostenko is #1 in all these lists. Because of course, so many people from different generations, for example, even my parents, of course, if you ask them about the main figure in Ukrainian literature, I think they also tell you that this is Lina Kostenko. So many generations know her and know her poetry. Yes, this is already poet for many generations in Ukraine.
Yeah. So do you, again, as a writer and a reader and a cultural observer, do you see a conversation happening across generations? And is there information that you feel that an older generation has successfully imparted to you? I'll always remember hearing and meeting Ivan Drach when he came to Harvard. This was in the 90s, in the early 90s. And I remember asking him what he wanted for the next generation. And he had a very moving answer. He said immediately, more courage than we had. That's what he wanted for the next generation. And it's very much what I felt had happened to the Vishimdeshatnike. Everybody had indeed shown more courage. And it was through that showing of courage that it felt to me things really began to happen. And I feel like I've watched over the last 30 years as the culture has unfolded. I remember speaking with Solomia Pavlichko back in the 90s about the transformation of Ukrainian literature. Is there any kind of overview that you might offer about how Ukrainian literature has evolved or changed over the last 3? I know this is a huge question, but I can't think of somebody better positioned than you to be able to offer such a synthetic view.
You know, I think that in my professional life, it's one of the most important questions, yes, which I try to solve, try to understand within my works. And there is a special moment maybe in my biography because when I was a student, I started to work as a journalist in a literary magazine. And it's a bit strange maybe for my generation because you remember this period of literary magazines in a Soviet period of time. There were so many magazines which had really so many copies which were distributed around Ukraine, yes, and other cities. And one of them, which was Prapor in a Soviet time and then become Berezil, fortunately, it continued their work when I was a student. And it was, I don't know why, but it was my dream to start to work for a literary magazine. Yes, I don't know why I have such a dream, but I met their editor, Volodymyr Naumenko, and I started to work with them when I was 18 years old, it seems. So I spent 4-5 years of my life with people from different generations. So all surnames which you mentioned already, but also very important surname, Sverstyuk, yes, Johann Sverstyuk,
Sure.
and so many people from this generation of 60s. There were people who I recorded, yes, for my interviews, who I saw in our office in Kharkiv, and their books I read when I was a student. So for me, it was very important to feel that there are no any gaps between yes different generations, though so many people think that after Soviet period of our history we had big gaps between every generation. So I always have this feeling that it's very important to understand every generation and to see all these lines and connections between generations. Even if we think about Soviet period of time, when we think about awful repressions of Soviet regime against our Ukrainian artists and writers and intellectuals, even then, when so many people were killed by Soviet and Russian regime, even then there were people who saved this connection between generations. And I think that, you know, so many people who are abroad, yes, saved this memory about Ukrainian culture, about Ukrainian literature. And for example, in my project Requisites, I finished 3 volumes of this project, and I recorded for that volumes 30 Ukrainian writers. And our first hero was Anatoly Dimarov. He was 92 years old when we decided to speak to him. And also we spoke to Ivan Drach, Dmitro Pavlichko, Yuri Mushkatek, and Valery Shevchuk, and other people from that generation, but also this generation of Visimdesatniki, yes, this generation of Serhiy Zhadan or Galina Kruk. So today I recorded like 40 interviews with Ukrainian writers for that project. And every time when I spoke to other Ukrainian writer, I tried to find all these connections with previous generations. It was like my main idea to show our audience, to show my readers that it's not right to think that there are gaps between generations in Ukrainian culture and literature. And what I also want to say that, of course, I think that between Шістдесятники and Вісімдесятники in Ukrainian literature, there was a bigger distance, unfortunately. And it's not only it's because of time when they grew up. It's because of different systems, yes, political systems. It's because of different atmosphere of their life. This distance, we can understand this distance today, but of course in 90s and later, I think this distance, it's not so big today between different generations. And I know that every young writer can write to, for example, Serhiy Zhadan or Yuri Andrukhovich or Taras Prohasko today to ask their thoughts about something, to ask to read their poetry or novel or something else, or they can meet them at some literary festivals, for example. So it's easier to be closer to each other in Ukrainian culture today, but it's not only because of another time in Ukraine, it's also because of another period in communications. It's not only in Ukraine, yes, it's time of social media, it's time of internet and so on. So I think today we don't have any gaps between generations, but also I'd like to tell you about one of our projects in Pan Ukraine. The idea of this project was the idea of Ostap Slivinsky, our colleague, brilliant Ukrainian poet and translator. And Ostap decided to offer Pan Ukraine to launch a festival workshop for young Ukrainian writers. And our idea within this festival, which we organized first time in Ivano-Frankivsk last September, our idea was to create such a space in Ivano-Frankivsk, very important city in the history of Ukrainian literature, modern Ukrainian literature, to create this space where we won't have any distances between generations in our literature. And because of that, for example, 20 years old poet had a possibility to speak to Yuri Andrukhovich or Taras Prohasko at this festival, and it was such a great atmosphere. Yes, I just have a dream that we will have another festival this autumn in Ukraine.
That's great. No, I also think it's so very important to have this continuity and the dialogue across generations, because of course circumstances do keep changing and aesthetic structures vary. New possibilities for hybrid forms are arising because of the media, and because of just the inevitable pressure of the creative process to attempt to try new things. And at the same time, as T.S. Eliot once observed, when a young poet said to him, "Why should we read these old poets? We know so much more than they do." And he said, "Yes, and they are what we know." That is, that what we know is the past, and we are then able to add our voice to it to move things forward. So that's beautiful. I don't want to keep you much longer, but I have just two more questions for you. One is, so I like to say to friends informally, but I've also said this publicly, that Ukraine is a country that was created by a poet. And that may be overstating it, but it seems to me that Shevchenko played an unusual role, and I can't think of a comparable figure in world literature who has had as much of an influence on a country as Shevchenko did, perhaps in part because he brought the indigenous language, if you will, into a kind of literary, into the level of high literature, and it gave the voice of the people an opportunity to speak with in their own language. But I say that just as a way of asking whether you feel that Ukrainian writers still play as important a role in the culture as they did in other periods in history, and what is it that you expect that writers will be? How will they have been affected by the war? I mean, a new generation's growing up that is having unprecedented experience, one that the country is not known for 80 years. What kind of effect do you think it will have on cultural relations, both within the country and beyond its borders?
It's a very long and difficult question, of course, and especially at this moment, nobody knows what type of literature and what texts, yes, we will have about this war and about this period of our life in future, because now we have very important moment of fixation, yes, of our feelings and all these events. So this is time of photographers, of diaries, first of all, yes, and of poetry. You remembered about Taras Shevchenko, but we can also think about periods of our current history, yes, in Ukraine. You remember the role of poets within Maidan, our revolution of dignity. So I remember, of course, all these very quick and very emotional poetries which we had during the most difficult days and months of our revolution in Ukraine. But it was really very strong poetry, and it was very important part of our fight, yes, in 2014, of course. And today, I also see how many new poetry we have already in Ukraine, especially, I don't know, I remember even first day of this new period of the war. And I remember poetry's texts written by Mariana Savka or Vasyl Makhno and other Ukrainian poets. And this is great poetry. And I saw so many quotes, so many pictures with all these sentences and quotes in Ukrainian internet, for example. So I think for us Ukrainians, it's really very important to feel our reality as poetry. Poetry sometimes helps to not maybe understand, but to feel, to understand your feelings, yes, in this concrete moment of your life. So I think even now, this is time of Ukrainian poets. And, you know, maybe even if you think about this moment that usually, for example, poetry book has in Ukraine 2,000 of copies, usually. Yes, sometimes it could be 5,000 or more, for example, for Lina Kostenko, yes, who we mentioned already. But usually it's not a big amount of copies in Ukraine, to be honest. But, you know, I always remember one phrase of Konstantin Moskalets, also big Ukrainian modern poet. And I remember when he told that poetry and poets help us to structure our reality. So help us to work with all these gaps, yes, in our life. And I think that it's very important that Ukraine has so many great poets who help structure our reality and our life. You know, there are so many discussions about Ukrainian prose writers, yes, who can be nominated for different awards and prizes abroad, but nobody hesitates about Ukrainian poetry. Of course, we have so many bright poets who must be heard by the world. And it's not only about modern Ukrainian poetry. You mentioned Taras Shevchenko. I also think that today we have new period for opening, yes, Taras Shevchenko for the world. And I think this is a very important task now for Ukrainian cultural community to open again our culture for the world. And not only our modern culture, our modern literature, of course, it's very important. And this is the easiest way, yes, to tell the world about the culture, to tell about current period of our life. But it's also very big and difficult task for many, many years in our future to show the world that we have really great culture in Ukraine. This is our main task for future years.
Yeah, beautifully said. Tetyana, thank you. One just last question. Is there any final idea or note that you want to leave with your American audience here? Anything, last things you want to say to them right for now?
We spoke about culture, we spoke about Ukrainian literature. So I think this is also a great possibility to remind that today our cultural community, our literature community also need help and support. And as I told, we have this very important task to open again our culture for the world. So I can ask you to help us to do that, to help us to translate our writers, to translate our great poets, to show our artists, to show the world our great musicians and other Ukrainian intellectuals. So if you have this possibility to tell the world, to tell your media, to tell your audience about Ukrainian culture, just believe me that we have so many bright names in our history, in our culture, that you definitely will find many new names and many new texts in our culture. So you will have a big pleasure just to meet Ukrainian culture today.
Tetyana, Teren, thank you so very much for your time. I know it's late in Lviv, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Askold, thank you so much for your support and for everything what you do for Ukraine today.